Why do you avoid parties and banal conversations? The explanation will surprise you. Have you ever wondered why some people just don't like to socialize? It's not shyness, nor arrogance. It's something deeper and perhaps even more common than it seems. In a world where superficial social life is practically a rule, those who prefer silence often end up being seen as strangers. But what if, in fact, this is a sign of something bigger? The psychology of loneliness reveals that this behavior can be directly linked to the level of consciousness and the type of thinking that the person develops. It's no wonder that names like Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche already talked about the difficulty of connecting in a world full of distractions. The more deep thinking, the greater the chance of seeing what most people ignore, and that completely changes the way you relate to others. Now think with me, what if your desire to stay more in your own is not a problem, but rather an indication of deep self-knowledge? What if the relationship between intelligence and isolation is not a defect, but a natural consequence of those who seek something beyond the obvious? Stay with me until the end, because what you'll discover here can completely change the way you see yourself and the world around you. You know that feeling of not fitting in anywhere, even when you're surrounded by people? Well, many people associate this with shyness or even a social problem, but the truth can be much deeper. The psychology of loneliness suggests that this withdrawal is not always weakness. Sometimes it is a sign of a deep thought that simply does not find an echo around it. Great names like Arthur Schopenhauer already reflected on this back then, within the so-called pessimistic philosophy, where society is seen as superficial and repetitive. And look how curious, the more a person develops their deep self-knowledge, the more they realize that many interactions are empty. It's not arrogance. It is really refined perception. And then the dilemma arises: why do so many brilliant minds seem to prefer silence to social noise? Is there a direct link between intelligence and isolation, or are we misinterpreting this? Before drawing conclusions, it is worth exploring this scenario calmly. Because what seems like loneliness is often just the beginning of something much bigger. When we dive into Arthur Schopenhauer's ideas, we quickly realize that he didn't have much patience for superficial social life. For him, most human interactions revolved around futilities, vanities, and small ego disputes. Within the pessimistic philosophy, society was not exactly a space for growth, but rather a stage of distractions. And between us, if you've ever left a conversation thinking, "Damn, that didn't add anything," maybe you're starting to see what he saw. Schopenhauer believed that people with deep thinking tend to get tired of these shallow exchanges. It's not that they feel superior, it's more a matter of incompatibility, almost like trying to tune a radio to the wrong frequency. This connects directly with the idea of genius versus mediocrity, where the problem is not in judging others, but in noticing the difference in interests and levels of reflection. And then a silent discomfort arises: continue participating in this social game or seek something more meaningful? That choice starts to pull the thread from the next point. There is a somewhat uncomfortable idea, but it appears in both philosophy and psychology: the higher the level of consciousness, the greater the distance. Arthur Schopenhauer already suggested this, and Friedrich Nietzsche also reinforced it, not as an absolute rule, but as a tendency. Such intelligence and isolation end up going hand in hand when the person begins to see beyond the obvious. Think of it this way: the more you develop deep thinking, the less tolerable it becomes to repeat shallow subjects, gossip, or predictable patterns. This is not a lack of social skills, it is a kind of mental fatigue. The mind wants something denser, more real. And when that doesn't show up in the environment, silence becomes more comfortable than company. This is where the so-called intellectual loneliness comes in, not as a punishment, but as a natural consequence of those who seek more depth. Within the psychology of loneliness, this type of isolation can even be healthy at certain times. But of course, It also raises an important question: to what extent is this distancing a choice, and when does it begin to become a necessity? As the level of consciousness increases, one thing begins to become very clear: finding people on the same frequency is not that simple. Arthur Schopenhauer already said that most people seek distraction, not depth. And when you go on a journey of deep self-knowledge, you realize that not everyone is interested in going that far. This explains why so many brilliant minds face this sense of displacement. It's not a lack of people around. It's a lack of real connection. Conversations that start out promising end up falling into the shallows, and that desire for meaningful exchanges is always a little frustrated. The psychology of loneliness shows that this emptiness does not come from the absence of people, but from the absence of depth in relationships. In practice, this creates a natural filter. You start to select more with those who share your time, your ideas, your energy. And, of course, this can intensify intellectual loneliness, but it also avoids that wear and tear of living meaningless relationships. The question that remains is it worth insisting on superficial connections? Or learn to deal better with this natural selection? In many moments, social life seems more like a big stage than a space for a real connection. Arthur Schopenhauer saw this quite clearly within his pessimistic philosophy: people don't show who they are, but who they need to appear to be. And when you develop deep thinking, it's hard to ignore this theater going on all the time. Do you know when someone changes completely depending on who they are talking to? Or when a conversation feels more like an approving game than a heartfelt exchange? Well, this reflects exactly this idea of superficial social life. And the more you notice these dynamics, the more that inner discomfort ceases if you're participating in something that no longer makes sense. It is at this point that intelligence and isolation begin to intersect again. Because, honestly, maintaining several social masks is tiring, and observing those of others as well. Many brilliant minds prefer the authenticity of silence to the exhaustion of social performances. But this perception raises an interesting question. Is it possible to live in society without getting into this game? To understand this dynamic more deeply, it is worth looking at one of Arthur Schopenhauer's central ideas, the so-called will. According to him, there is an irrational force within all of us that constantly pushes us to desire, compete, and seek validation. Within pessimistic philosophy, this desire is never satisfied, and it is precisely this that feeds much of superficial social life. Now think with me how many social interactions are driven by ego, status, or the need for acceptance. Likes, approval, recognition. All of these can be seen as manifestations of this will. And when someone develops deep self-knowledge, they begin to see these motivations more clearly. It's almost like seeing the backstage of a show that once seemed natural. This awakening can intensify intellectual loneliness, because it becomes difficult to participate in certain dynamics without questioning everything inside. The psychology of loneliness shows that this type of perception can generate a certain distance, not by rejection of others, but by understanding what is really at stake. And then a new challenge arises: how to live with the world without letting yourself be carried away by these illusions. There comes a time when conflict is impossible to ignore. On the one hand, the search for meaning; on the other, the constant offer of distraction. Friedrich Nietzsche talked a lot about this, the difference between living consciously or just going with the flow. And when one develops deep thinking, superficial social life begins to seem too empty to sustain for long. It's like trying to participate in a conversation about something trivial while your mind is questioning purpose, existence, choices. It's not disdain, it's misalignment. The psychology of loneliness explains that this type of disconnection can generate a certain isolation, because the person simply does not find space to express what they really think. And then, of course, the relationship between intelligence and isolation comes in again. In the midst of all this, a constant tension arises: adapt to belong or stay true to one's own depth. Many brilliant minds end up oscillating between these two extremes. And between us, there is no easy answer. But perhaps the most interesting thing is to realize how this conflict prepares the ground for something even more concrete: the real examples of those who lived exactly that. When we look at history, we realize that this pattern is not just theory, it is repeated in practice. Names like Nikola Tesla, Isaac Newton, and Emily Dickinson are classic examples of brilliant minds who lived, to a greater or lesser extent, an intense intellectual loneliness. Each in their own way, but all with something in common: a deep dive into their own internal world. Tesla, for example, avoided social relationships and devoted himself almost obsessively to his ideas. Newton spent long periods in isolation, especially during the plague, when he developed fundamental concepts of physics. Emily Dickinson, on the other hand, chose a reclusive life, transforming her introspection into poetry. In all these cases, you can clearly see the relationship between deep thinking and social withdrawal. But here's an important point: it's not that genius requires solitude, but that it often flourishes better in this environment. The psychology of solitude suggests that silence can be fertile for creation and innovation. Still, this raises a delicate reflection: to what extent does this isolation strengthen? And when does it start to take a toll? Now comes the part that many people avoid talking about. Loneliness can be powerful, but it can also weigh in a lot. Even great names like Friedrich Nietzsche faced intense periods of isolation that took a heavy emotional toll. The psychology of loneliness shows that when the distance is prolonged, it can make room for anxiety, melancholy, and even a certain feeling of disconnection from the world. And look how curious: the more a person dives into deep self-knowledge, the more he becomes aware of these own pains. You can no longer get away with simple distractions. The mind begins to question everything: relationships, purpose, identity. And at this point, intellectual loneliness ceases to be just a refuge and becomes, at times, a real internal challenge. This does not mean that seeking depth is a mistake, quite the contrary. But it reveals that there is a delicate balance between intelligence and isolation. Many brilliant minds end up learning, sometimes the hard way, that inner growth needs to be accompanied by some level of external connection. And that's precisely where an interesting turn arises. Can loneliness be used strategically? Now look at what an interesting turn: what once seemed like a burden can become one of the biggest advantages. Intellectual loneliness, when well directed, becomes a fertile ground for creation. Arthur Schopenhauer already argued that isolation allows a more direct contact with one's own thoughts, without noise, without distractions, without that constant pressure of superficial social life. Think about how many ideas you've had in silence, at that moment, just for you. The psychology of loneliness shows that the brain enters a more reflective state when it is not being bombarded by external stimuli. It is in this space that deep thinking gains strength. If you want to apply this in practice, try setting aside 30 minutes a day without a cell phone, without social networks, just you and your ideas. It sounds simple, but it's powerful. Many brilliant minds have learned to use this isolation as fuel, not as a prison. And that completely changes the game. The relationship between intelligence and isolation is no longer a problem and becomes a tool. But of course, there is still an important dilemma behind all this: to what extent can we balance this need for introspection with our human side that also seeks connection? Here we enter one of the most human conflicts that exist. As much as someone values intellectual solitude, there is still a natural need for connection. No matter the level of deep thought or deep self-knowledge, the human being remains, deep down, a social being. And this is where the relationship between intelligence and isolation becomes even more complex. Even thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer, with all his pessimistic philosophy, recognized this paradox. The mind seeks depth, silence, reflection. But the heart, sometimes, asks for exchange, presence, belonging. And when these two forces come into conflict, that strange feeling arises, wanting to be alone but not all the time. In practice, many brilliant minds live exactly in this unstable equilibrium. They pull away to preserve their energy and mental clarity, but they also lack genuine connections. The psychology of loneliness shows that the problem is not isolation per se, but the absence of significant bonds. And this opens up space for an essential question: is there a way to live in society without giving up one's own depth? We come to a more practical point in the conversation: how to live all this without getting lost. The answer lies not in rejecting society, but in developing a certain emotional detachment. Arthur Schopenhauer already pointed out this path within pessimistic philosophy, and thinkers such as Marcus Aurelius reinforced this idea with a more balanced approach. In practice, this means learning to participate in social life without depending on it to feel complete. You can interact, talk, even have fun, but without getting caught up in superficial social life. A simple exercise: observe your interactions throughout the day and ask yourself, is this nourishing me or just filling time? This type of awareness strengthens deep self-knowledge and avoids unnecessary wear and tear. Many brilliant minds have found this middle ground. They use intellectual solitude as a source of clarity and coexistence as a tool, not as a desperate need. The psychology of loneliness shows that balance is possible, but it takes practice and intention. And perhaps the most interesting thing is to realize that this is not an end point. It is just the beginning of a new way of living. And now, let me ask you a very direct question: have you lived according to your depth? Or have you adapted to the shallow just to fit in? Along the way, it has become clear that the psychology of loneliness does not point to loneliness as a problem in itself, but as a sign sometimes of growth, sometimes of misalignment. The point is not to run away from people, but to understand your own level of consciousness. Perhaps you've recognized yourself at various times here in the search for deep thought, in the difficulty of dealing with superficial social life, or even in this delicate balance between connection and isolation. And that's okay. The journey of deep self-knowledge is not linear, and much less comfortable. But it is, without a doubt, transformative. Now tell me, what are you going to do with it? It will continue to ignore this inner call, or start using this awareness as an advantage in your life. If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there's a lot more to help you see the world in a way that few can.